At the start of their campaign in the Pacific, the Japanese Navy had faced four major opponents: the US Pacific Fleet, which had been substantially crippled at Pearl Harbor, the US Asiatic Fleet or Asiatic Squadron, which had been effectively destroyed almost immediately thereafter, and the survivors of the latter had combined with the next threat on their list, the Dutch Navy, as well as elements of the British and Australian fleets, to form ABDA Command, which had been summarily crushed in a couple of months in early 1942. Thus, by the end of February and early March 1942, pending the US Pacific Fleet marshalling its remaining strength, the only remaining potential naval opposition to the Japanese Navy's efforts in the immediate term was the British Eastern Fleet. Scattered remnants of ABDA Command did still exist, and the bulk of the Royal Australian Navy had survived, but unless and until the Japanese pressed significantly further south, these were unlikely to be much of an issue, and even the threat of a couple of heavy cruisers and a handful of smaller vessels was not particularly massive compared to the overall strength of the Imperial Japanese fleet at the time. Although the British had just lost their major naval base at Singapore, the Royal Navy could still bring carriers, battleships, and all sorts of other assets to the party, and with the Japanese Navy's eyes turned eastwards across the Pacific, the last thing they needed was a potential British force hitting them from behind. Although the Royal Navy had deployed and lost force Z already, Yamamoto knew that they were unlikely to make the same mistake twice, and more to the point, even if the Eastern Fleet didn't try and interfere in the Pacific operations, the Japanese army was steadily making its way through Southeast Asia, and if there was one thing the Japanese Navy wanted to hear even less than the unexpected appearance of enemy warships in their supply echelons, it was the Japanese army whining about how, oh, my supply lines are being cut, and the Japanese Navy, you really should do something about this. The other options that the Japanese had on the table were to make a go at going straight after Australia, or to try and force what was left of the Pacific Fleet to come out and fight, but with the huge distances of the Pacific and Indian Ocean, the main strength of the Japanese fleet could only be brought to bear on one of these targets at a time. Going after Australia immediately was quickly dismissed, as it was clear that any major effort made in this area would only really be worth it if it was accompanied by landings which could occupy various northern ports. This in turn would need several Japanese army divisions, and the Japanese army refused to provide them with any. Blockading Australia, or its supply routes, would take too long, and due to the size of Australia, fix too much of the Japanese Navy's assets in a broad sweep, which would thin them out, and so that was out of the picture as well. Confronting the US Pacific Fleet was seen as the primary objective, but Admiral Yamamoto was already starting his preparations for what would eventually become the Midway Campaign, and this left something of a gap between the start of 1942 and the planned start date for that particular adventure, into which removing the potential thorn in the side that was the Royal Navy seemed to slot in quite nicely. As an interesting side note, at this stage the Japanese Navy seemed to be contemplating that if they did manage to destroy the American fleet at Midway, or a large part of it, maybe they should attempt landings in Hawaii to further hamper any attempted American counteroffensive. But in more proximate matters, the majority of the Japanese Navy's frontline strength happened to be in the Southwest Pacific, mopping up most of the Dutch East Indies anyway. The Indian Ocean, therefore, happened to be quite nearby. The British, meanwhile, had fallen back to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, basing themselves out of the port of Trincomalee. But everyone on both sides expected a rather major Japanese offensive to take this facility out as well, and the Royal Navy, in anticipation of this, prepared a 250-page document outlining in precise detail every single possible anchorage in the entirety of the Indian Ocean and related regions that could be used as further fallback positions, both fleet-sized anchorages and individual harbours that could be used for dispersed operations such as supporting submarine flotillas or a few destroyers. Top of the list were Fremantle in Australia, Mombasa in Kenya, and South Africa generally, with a split between Simonstown and Cape Town and the port of Durban. But there were other ideas like Adu Atoll, which were also detailed. although it was noted that all repairs at said atoll would have to be done by ship, and so to form a base there, base ships, accommodation ships, repair ships, and floating dry docks would have to be brought in. As it was, any facility that might be required soon wouldn't have to be particularly large, as the Royal Navy's strength in the Far East had been massively diminished compared to pre-war, both to feed the various theatres of war in Europe, and with the loss of Force Z and those ships placed under ABDA command, which had sapped the remaining strength that the Royal Navy still had in the area further. Still, having major supply routes compromised by a Japanese base in the middle of the Indian Ocean and facing yet another major retreat wasn't the preferred outcome for the Royal Navy, and so preparations to retreat, if necessary, were also accompanied by a crash course in reinforcement to try and forestall that possibility. Almost 150 anti-aircraft guns, thousands of troops, and a total of more than 100 fighter aircraft were ferried to Ceylon as fast as possible, along with a couple of flat-pack radar stations. Strike aircraft followed in various forms, and whilst the Mediterranean was still a cauldron of war, it was also going through a brief, calmer period at the very start of 1942, so ships were pulled in from all over the world to assemble a coherent force. This was made somewhat easier by the Japanese entry into the war having brought the USA into the war, as well as Japan's Axis allies had declared war on the USA shortly thereafter. Older US Navy ships, as well as a number that were working up, were helping out in the Atlantic, and that freed up Royal Navy ships from that area. And soon, what was on paper an impressive force was made ready. 5 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers plus a Dutch ship which was along for the ride, and 13 destroyers, along with another Dutch guest in this class. A few other small ships were scattered around in the theatre as well, but the main force, compared to the 2 aircraft carriers, several cruisers and 11 destroyers of the Japanese force that Allied intelligence reported, it seemed like a fair matchup, even if some of the more tentative intel reports that indicated a battlecruiser or 2 might be coming were accurate. A naval transmission marked Most Secret reveals the likely cause of the confusion between what the Allies thought the Japanese were deploying and what they were actually deploying, which we'll come to in a minute. Signals Intel had read a good portion of Japanese naval transmissions and put together a picture of what was actually going on. But crucially, of course, you can only determine from such intel stuff that the enemy actually transmits. And what they seemed to have picked up were the strike orders for the attack, but they'd mistaken the Japanese term used to refer to their carrier strike force as translating to carrier unit. Knowing that the Japanese Navy had used the same kind of terminology to refer to an American carrier attack group the previous month, they assumed, therefore, that this carrier unit would be 2 carriers, a cruiser squadron, and a destroyer flotilla. Of course, what it actually meant in Japanese was the carrier fleet, the Kido Butai. They also picked up signals which ordered Kaga to return to Japan and then to attack target DG. Now, they'd figured out from other intercepted Japanese submarine signals that DG meant a target on Ceylon, since they'd intercepted communications from 2 subs operating in the DG area, and from other references in those reports, as well as sightings by recon aircraft, they determined that the subs were operating near Ceylon. Thus, they concluded that Kaga's carrier division must be the one that was assigned to the attack, and that it was heading for Ceylon, when in fact everyone but Kaga was actually heading there. Now, interestingly, whilst they misinterpreted the meaning of carrier units in the translation, they did notice the specific use of the term attack as opposed to invasion or advance, and thus concluded that this would be a raid that they also concluded was aimed at ships and not a full-scale offensive and invasion. They also happened to get the date right, anticipating a Japanese strike of around the 1st of April. But coming back to the British fleet, what the on-paper figures don't show is that 4 of the British cruisers were smaller, older ships. There were no Town, Leander, or even Arethusa class light cruisers present. 4 of the battleships were older and slower R-class, and one of the aircraft carriers was the stately but again quite small and slow HMS Hermes. Placed in command, Admiral Somerville recognised the problem and formed his forces into 2 groups. Force A faster group with the recently repaired battleship Warspite, leading the fast armoured carriers Indomitable and Formidable, along with the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and the more capable of his light cruisers, the Emerald and Enterprise, along with 6 destroyers. The older and smaller ships were collectively placed in Force B, which was ordered to follow and exploit any situations that Force A might manage to open up, but they would hang far enough back to be able to make a run for it if Force A signalled that they'd been forced to retreat. But there was another complication to the estimates, and that was that the Japanese weren't just coming with 2 carriers in actual fact. They were planning on coming with 6, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Zuikaku, and Shokaku, the force that had wrecked Pearl Harbor. But Kaga then grounded herself, and the force was reduced to 5 as ongoing complications from this meant that Kaga was ordered off home for repairs. But the 5 fleet carriers were still an overwhelming force as long as they could get their aircraft up into the sky. On the Japanese side of things, a separate raiding force centered around the small carrier Rugio was being sent out on a raiding mission, also into the Indian Ocean, but the main force, which we're going to cover, was aiming to steam at speed into the Indian Ocean and repeat December 7th, 1941 again by catching the Eastern Fleet in port and destroying it. This was, however, only to be a very large raid, as the Japanese army had once again refused to supply any troops to the Japanese navy, this time obviously for an invasion of Ceylon, and so the mission goals were limited to destroying enemy fleet assets and disrupting trade. Japanese intelligence on the strength of the British forces in the area was patchy, and they also underestimated the strength of overall opposition. This resulted in both sides going into this action rather confident that they had a reasonable degree of superiority over the other. The British forces were split between Colombo and Trincomalee, both ports in Ceylon, and Adu Atoll, a bit to the south. But they were monitoring a number of other significant indicators of enemy activity. A review of the most secret intel files at the time shows that the Royal Navy was aware that prior to major operations, the Japanese Navy usually went suspiciously radio silent in the area that they were gathering their forces in, but as soon as the operation had been launched, that area went back to transmitting, and usually with an increased volume of traffic, presumably clearing out a backlog of messages they hadn't been able to send before. This actually gave a pretty good indication both that a major operation was being planned and where it was assembling, and then when the radio transmissions peaked again, when it had left. Late February and most of March saw regular transmission blackouts from the central part of the Dutch East Indies. It just so happened that the Celebes were where the Japanese Navy was assembling its raiding force. The initial Japanese plan was to launch the attack in the 3rd week of March, having departed in the 2nd week. But this was delayed as USS Enterprise launched an attack on the Japanese facilities on the Marcus Islands at the start of March, followed just under a week later by a raid by Yorktown and Lexington on other bases. This caused delays because Shokaku and Zuikaku made attempts to intercept Enterprise, and shortly thereafter, the erroneous reports of American carriers heading for Tokyo caused still further concerns. As a result, the 2 most capable Japanese carriers ended up burning off a lot of fuel, then having to head back to Japan to refuel, and then head south again, which delayed the start of Operation C, as the raid was now called, to the end of March, with a planned attack date on Ceylon, which was now moved to the 5th of April. This meant that the British were now slightly out of step with the Japanese Navy, as the plans they deduced from signals intel were for earlier versions, which had called for the attack on Ceylon itself to begin on the 1st of April, with previous operations in the 3rd week of March as they'd advanced. Shortly before the fleet sailed, the Japanese Navy was sent a final force estimate. They reckoned that the Royal Navy had 3 R-class, the carriers Hermes and Indomitable, and 4 cruisers in the area, although quite where they dug up the name HMS Susan for one of the carriers, I'll never know. They expected the arrival of 2 further carriers and the battleships Warspite and King George V in the near future. In actual fact, Warspite had just arrived, and the carrier Formidable was only days out at the time that the intel was sent to the Kido Butai. King George V was, of course, nowhere near the area. Submarine reconnaissance elements were ordered to provide as much information as possible in the form of operational updates, and the fleet duly sailed on the 26th of March 1942. British intel, in turn, updated Somerville that the Japanese force may include some of the Kongo class, but they still thought that 2 carriers, maybe 3, was the most that the Japanese were sending. Somerville himself had only arrived 2 days earlier, coming in aboard the Formidable, but he'd kept up with the news, and anticipating Japanese attack on the 1st of April, he considered a moonlight night attack, timed to allow a dawn landing back on the carriers, as the most tactically advantageous for the Japanese Navy, despite the lack of any Japanese Navy carrier-borne night attacks thus far. He got his forces underway ahead of time, with the first of his ships sailing on the 29th, then the rest on the 30th, and then when all of these ships had sorted into their assigned groups, they would head to their start points on the 31st of March. The idea was to position his ships to the southwest of the anticipated Japanese line of advance and wait for them to make their first move. Then, when either radio emissions, reconnaissance flights, or other intelligence gave away the position of the Japanese ships, he would move in at speed and hit the Japanese forces with a surprise night attack from the air, followed up, if needed, by a surface assault. This is reflected in the makeup of the carrier's air groups. Although there were 37 fighters available, a mixture of Sea Hurricanes, Fulmars and Martlets, which is the Royal Navy's name for the F4F Wildcat, there were almost 4 whole squadrons worth of torpedo bombers making up the majority of the carrier's air groups, all trained relatively extensively for night action and equipped with a number of aircraft carrying air-to-surface search radar, known as ASV. The Japanese Navy, on the other hand, had no night fighter training, very little in the way of night-based anti-aircraft gun capability, and they would be facing more torpedoes in the water if the British launched all of their torpedo bombers than the Japanese Navy themselves had sent downrange at Pearl Harbor. Given the resources that he had to hand, it wasn't a bad plan. There was an additional squadron of Swordfish available on Hermes, which was completely stocked with them, to the expense of all other aircraft, but she was small and slow to the extent that even the venerable Swordfish needed a pretty good headwind to get off of Hermes' flight deck when it was fully loaded, so this 5th squadron of Swordfish couldn't necessarily be counted on. Somerville had taken his fleet well to the southwest to avoid any submarines or aircraft which he thought might be scouting ahead of the Japanese fleet, and he then sailed east-northeast overnight, with Force B lagging about 20 miles behind Force A, aiming to be about 120 miles from what he anticipated to be the Japanese Navy's launch position by 6 o'clock in the evening. Radar-equipped aircraft would then look for targets until about 2:30 in the morning, and if nothing was seen, the fleet would have time to fall back to the west. Of course, with the delays to the Japanese Navy's operations, the Kido Butai was actually about 1,500 miles away, and so the reconnaissance flights found nothing. Of course, not knowing this, Somerville spent the 1st of April searching for them, then repeated the night approach on a slightly different course, and further searching throughout the day on the 2nd also brought nothing, and so it seemed perhaps the Japanese weren't coming out to play after all. Somerville reasoned that this was either because the enemy's schedule had been changed by some outside factor, which we now know was actually the case, or the intel he'd been given was flat out wrong, or possibly the Japanese had learned that the Royal Navy was out at sea and was waiting for them to go back into port. This last option being the one that Somerville at the time thought was the most likely. Deciding to deny them the chance to hit his ships in port, but also needing to top up fresh water supplies on the R-class, a number of which had boiler tube leaks and condenser problems, he directed his ships to Ado Atoll, which he was fairly confident the Japanese Navy didn't know about as a base, and was in any case not their anticipated target. At almost the same time, the Japanese were just beginning their final approach to Ceylon, conducting numerous aerial recon sweeps, but finding nothing more exciting than the occasional merchant ship. Various attempts by the recon aircraft, both from carriers and flying boats, to bomb them met with no success, although the submarine I-7 did manage to sink the approximately 9,400-ton SS Glen Shiel with torpedoes and gunfire. The first sign of an actual enemy came on the afternoon of the 4th, when a Catalina on its way home after the second patrol of the day spotted a ship on the horizon. Getting closer, the crew realised they'd spotted the screen of the Kido Butai and made for home at full power. Realising they might be jumped by fighters at any moment, they made repeated calls that they'd located the enemy fleet, as well as its position and course. Zuikaku quickly launched a number of Zeros in pursuit. They caught up with the Catalina, which was in a shallow dive at its maximum possible speed, but that was still well short of 200 miles an hour, and when it was on its third transmission cycle. That cycle was never completed as a 20mm cannon shell destroyed the radio set. On fire in numerous places, the Catalina quickly began to break apart in midair, but thanks to already being at low altitude thanks to said shallow dive, the pilot managed to crash land into the sea. The destroyer Isokaze was sent to pick up survivors, but for unknown reasons, whilst Isokaze was still manoeuvring to come alongside, several Zeros from the now active Combat Air Patrol dived down on the stranded and burning flying boat, riddling it with gunfire, sinking it and killing 3 of the 9 men aboard. Isokaze rescued the half-dozen survivors and rejoined the fleet. The main part of the transmission, which reported that 3 battleships and a carrier had been sighted, had made it to Ceylon, and when the Catalina failed to respond to repeated radio calls and then didn't return to base a few hours later, the British concluded it had been shot down. This information was related to Somerville, who was now left to scramble his forces. Thinking the Japanese Navy wasn't coming, the Royal Navy was in the process of reconfiguring its forces to go and take Madagascar off Vichy France. Somerville himself wasn't entirely convinced he'd seen the last of Nagumo, but had thought that a Japanese Navy return to the area wouldn't be for a while, and so he'd sent the heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall back to Ceylon, the former to refit and get new radar installed, and the latter to escort a convoy. Hermes, with the destroyer Vampire, had been sent to Trincomalee to reconfigure for the Madagascar operation. On the 3rd and the 4th, reconnaissance flights had been sent out, but these were aimed at keeping up training and spotting for submarines, although a 24-strong torpedo bomber practice strike on Force B had also been conducted to prepare for mass strikes on enemy targets eventually, since many ships in the fleet had only operated together in the past few weeks and they were still trying to gel as a unit. The news that the enemy was now present left the issue that the British ships, so recently arrived at Adu Atoll, hadn't had a chance to refuel and, in the case of the battleships, re-water just yet. And Somerville didn't want to leave Force B behind entirely, as if 3 or potentially more enemy battleships, and who knew how many cruisers, were actually present. It would be a tough challenge for Warspite to take them all on alone if they counterattacked after he hit the Japanese carriers. The main advantage was that he knew where the Japanese were going, so he recalled Cornwall and Dorsetshire and ordered Force A to be ready to leave at midnight, the earliest that the cruisers Emerald and Enterprise could be ready, and Force B was to follow in the morning. Over in Ceylon, all possible vessels still in the port of Colombo were ordered to clear the area and not come back until the late afternoon of the 5th at the earliest. A few would remain in port for various reasons, mostly poor condition or being in the middle of repairs, but more than half made it out to sea. More reconnaissance reports filtered in, reporting various mixes of destroyers, cruisers, and the odd battleship, but none of them reported any further carrier sightings. This reinforced the idea, in the British mind, of there being relatively few carriers with the Japanese formation. Happily unaware of both Somerville's predicament or location, Nagumo forged ahead with his first aircraft strike group loaded up with bombs suitable for hitting land targets and soft merchant ships. Even the torpedo bombers were to be loaded with bombs and not torpedoes. If they spotted warships, then semi-armour piercing 1,600-pound bombs on the Kates would be able to do some damage, and then the second strike group could be sent in with proper armour-piercing bombs later. Emphasis was now placed on destroying base facilities first. Aircraft carriers were the top priority targets if warships were spotted, But once they knew they'd been spotted by the flying boats, this changed, and a reserve of torpedo-armed torpedo bombers was also created. Thus, on the morning of the 5th of April, the escorting battle cruisers and cruisers sent out reconnaissance aircraft of their own to ensure the seas around them were safe. Japanese Navy search patterns of the time consisted of the various aircraft flying out like the spokes on a wheel to a preset distance, and then orbiting in a search arc before then returning. Behind them, 128 aircraft were launched heading for Ceylon, followed by the Kido Butai turning to port and heading southwest to maintain distance from the island. 53 Val dive bombers were kept on hot standby, just in case Somerville's fleet was spotted. Theoretically, whilst the mixed fighters based in Ceylon were largely inferior to a Zero, there were a lot more of them present than the 36 Zeros running escort, and they'd be supported by anti-aircraft gunfire, and the Zeros needed to protect the vulnerable strike aircraft. Even if all else failed, the newly arrived radar station would be able to give a scramble warning in enough time for the fighters to get into position above the incoming attackers. But although a patrolling flight of Fulmars and a separate patrolling Catalina managed to spot the incoming Japanese aircraft, the recent influx of so many Allied types meant that both groups assumed that the aircraft they saw in the distance were another friendly group of fighters, possibly Hurricanes, and so they didn't raise any alarm. For reasons I haven't been able to fully determine, as it was operational, the shore-based radar station near Colombo also didn't spot the incoming strike, and so at 07:45, a Japanese aircraft appeared in the skies over Colombo and began their attack. Their arrival wasn't entirely unexpected, as we've already covered. The British knew the Japanese were likely to attack that morning, and so the anti-aircraft guns at least were ready, but without the final confirmed warning of incoming aircraft, the fighters were now forced to scramble even whilst Zeros dove in to pick them off as they struggled to gain altitude or even get off the airfield at all. This left the harbour exposed, as RAF and Fleet Air Arm aircraft had to then turn and fight over their own airfields. To be fair, in those areas they did put up at least a creditable effort. The Ratmalana airfield attack was contested well enough that the Japanese lost 6 aircraft shot down and another 6 badly damaged, in exchange for 11 British aircraft shot down, many of them during their initial takeoff climbs. Over the harbour, though, the Japanese had an almost unopposed run. A single formation of Hurricanes managed to intercept and went after some of the Vals, but without any other support, they were in turn jumped by Zeros, and quite a few of them were shot down. As the Japanese withdrew, as well as damage to the facilities, they damaged or sunk several merchant ships, damaged the submarine depot ship that was assigned to the area, and sunk the old destroyer Tenidos and the armed merchant cruiser Hector. They'd also downed a total of 19 or 20 fighters, depending on your source, damaged several more, and wiped out a flight of half a dozen Swordfish which had been headed for the Ratmalana airbase. A squadron of Blenheims, which were sent out for a counterattack, failed to find any targets. In exchange, 6 Vals and a Zero had been lost, with 9 Vals, 2 Kates, and 3 Zeros damaged, and in need of repair. Back aboard the Kido Butai, a second attack wave was being prepared when one of Tonei's scout aircraft reported spotting a pair of cruisers heading roughly their way. After a brief argument over whether the port facilities' further destruction or attacking the warships were more important, the 53 Vals that were kept on ready standby were launched and ordered to attack the cruisers. They headed off around about noon. Japanese recon aircraft kept in contact with the cruisers, updating them to specifically Kent-type heavy cruisers, and more dive bombers as well as torpedo bombers were ordered to make themselves ready for a follow-up attack. The ships they'd spotted were of course Cornwall and Dorsetshire on their way back to join Somerville. The captains of the 2 cruisers knew that they were being followed by spotter aircraft, and they now had to make a choice. They could turn and run west at high speed and hope to get themselves a little bit out of position for the inevitable Japanese attack, or they could try and press on towards Force A. Eventually, deciding that the presence of single-engined reconnaissance float planes meant that the Japanese carriers and their associated escorts were a lot closer than they'd originally anticipated, they decided to press on, reasoning that they wouldn't get out of range of the attack by heading westward, and they also decided to break radio silence and warn Somerville of what was going on. The veteran Japanese dive bomber pilots arrived and realised that there was no escort screen or fighter cover, and so, with only the two cruisers' anti-aircraft guns to trouble them, they spent time working around to a textbook diving attack position coming out of the sun. They then began their attack in a series of 3 aircraft strikes. The first trio to go after Dorsetshire managed to score hits with all 3 bombs, knocking out the ship's steering, radios, and the portside heavy anti-aircraft battery. Cornwall only suffered splinter damage from a near miss and the loss of its aircraft hangar from its first attack, but this was just the start. More and more trios came in and the hits began to add up, and with them the defensive fire began to slacken as men were killed or wounded and guns were knocked out. This of course made making further hits even easier, and within a quarter of an hour Dorsetshire had been hit 10 times with a number of damaging near misses, whilst Cornwall was hit 8 times with 6 near misses counted. Despite their best evasive action, the relatively nimble Japanese dive bombers and their skilled pilots either managed to anticipate and adjust for most of the turns, or, thanks to coming in from the sun, anti-aircraft fire, which was still at this stage guided by the human eye, even if they were using sights and fire control systems, was understandably inaccurate, which allowed the Vals to release their bombs at the last possible moment. This also improved their own accuracy. The radar aboard Warspite had actually tracked the Vals, which had passed less than 90 miles from its position on their way towards the cruisers, but Somerville couldn't risk his fleet by breaking radio silence in turn. Instead, around about the time the 2 cruisers were slipping beneath the waves, he sent out 4 Albacores to find the Japanese fleet, which by inference had to be relatively nearby. He couldn't save Cornwall and Dorsetshire, but he could at least try to avenge them. A destroyer was also dispatched to try and pick up any survivors. Shortly after this time, Nagumo decided to turn southeast for a bit after recovering aircraft, but Carrier Division 2, Hiryu and Soryu, instead turned northwest for a bit, the opposite direction. This left them alone and essentially unescorted, bar a trio of destroyers, and at around 1600, 2 of the 4 Albacores would find them. Unfortunately, Hiryu was incredibly quick on the draw, having apparently made this course change to launch a final combat air patrol for the day anyway, so she had Zeros warming up on deck, and they managed to catch the Albacores pretty quickly, shooting down one and damaging the other before a report could be fully radioed through. The damage to the second Albacore included destroying its transmitters, even though the aircraft remained flyable. This battered Albacore headed for home, carrying its vital news, namely that the enemy was only 125 miles away. Somerville had managed to bypass Nagumo's reconnaissance screens entirely, and was now on a collision course which would reach its terminus a few hours after sunset, which was exactly what he'd wanted. In fact, further Japanese recon efforts at this time were so short range that even if he'd been only 100 miles away, Somerville wouldn't have been seen before sunset. But about an hour after this encounter, and obviously not knowing about it, Somerville got 2 bits of information. The partial message from one of the Albacores had given the location of 5 enemy warships, but course, speed, and composition were all part of the data that had been cut off. In fact, the 5 warships were Soryu, Hiryu, and the 3 destroyers. But he also got another message from Ceylon, which said that all the way back at 2 in the afternoon, about 3 hours earlier at the point he was reading the message, a Catalina had seen enemy carriers heading at 24 knots southwest on a course of 230 degrees, although the Catalina didn't know where exactly this was. This information was hours old, but if it was true, and was combined with the known position but unknown course and speed from the Albacore report, which was made a couple of hours after that, It seemed to paint a picture of the Japanese heading for Adu Atoll, and at a speed that would mean the two forces were about to run into each other whilst there was still plenty of daylight around. And so, at 26 minutes past 5, Force A altered course to a southwesterly heading of 210 degrees to keep the distance open long enough to allow for him to close in and deliver his night attack. But then, just after 1800, the carriers sent a series of signals. The damaged albacore had returned and was able to update its report, now including enemy composition, 2 carriers and 3 unknown vessels, and the course heading was northwest. Their last sight of the enemy ships had been at 10 past 5. This changed everything. Replotting the distances, Somerville realised that when he changed course, the spotted enemy had only been 100 miles away. Indeed, post-battle analysis showed that had Force A kept heading east, Carrier Division 2 would have sailed merrily past Warspite's guns at about 2100. Still, with less than an hour spent on the new and wrong course, Somerville immediately ordered the fleet to change course and prepare for battle. All fighters were cleared from the flight decks, every single operational albacore and swordfish was wheeled into a ready position, torpedoes were loaded and flares mounted on the wings of every single bomber. Soon thereafter, a radar-equipped version rumbled into the sky. Somerville would keep launching radar-equipped search aircraft all night, at intervals of about 2 hours. The pilots of the torpedo bombers remained at their stations on the open decks until the early morning hours, waiting for a signal that the enemy had been spotted. But the course change had not only sent them in the wrong direction, away from the Japanese fleet, it had of course also prevented them from closing the distance, which doubled the effective distance that was lost. And so the search aircraft found themselves looking too short. Transposing their search patterns from where they would have launched without that 26 minutes past 5 course change, they would almost certainly have found Carrier Division 2. But it wasn't to be, and the disappointed strike crews eventually had to stand down. The next morning, Force A and Force B merged and remained at sea, hoping for better information. Further ships were dispatched to the area where the 2 cruisers had been sunk, as one thing the night recon flights had confirmed was the fate of Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and between them these vessels managed to rescue 1,122 survivors, which meant 424 men had either been killed in the attacks or succumbed to a day spent in the ocean. Still thinking the Japanese might be aware of and trying to attack his anchorage, Somerville hovered nearby, keeping up reconnaissance flights to try and find the Japanese Navy, but to no avail. In fact, Nagumo had headed east and was happily planning his next strike in comparative safety, although he still had no idea of just how close enemy ships had gotten, or even that Somerville was actually out at sea in the immediate area. To give a reference to a better-known battle, the British had spent the better part of a day hovering at an average distance from the Japanese carriers without being seen, which was about 60% closer than the US carriers had been at Midway when they'd first been spotted by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Having hit Colombo, Nagumo now planned to hit Trincomalee. This time, he wanted 2 waves to go in, the first concentrating on portside facilities and the second to go after any shipping. On the 7th, Ceylon-based aircraft swept the seas looking for the Kido Butai, but failed to find anything, whilst Somerville's own recon sweeps found a couple of Japanese submarines. Believing them to be the flank guards of a force that might still be going for his anchorage, Somerville took the Eastern Fleet to the west, intending to try and set up another flanking attack when the location of the Japanese carriers became clearer. He was also having to deal with the survivors of his 2 heavy cruisers, who were now distributed throughout the fleet, with the worst cases being sent ashore for treatment aboard the destroyer Paladin, escorted by the cruiser Emerald. News of Ruggio's raiding mission came through, and strategic planners successfully divined that the Kido Butai was probably actually going to come after Trincomalee next, but since the Japanese Navy had slipped the bounds of British reconnaissance, exactly how they would approach and when remained a mystery. By the morning of the 8th of April, it was also becoming increasingly apparent that there may well be more than 2 carriers in the Japanese main force, but Somerville kept looking anyway. still finding nothing. Concluding that wherever they were, his anchorage was now safe, the Eastern Fleet re-entered Adu Atoll again just before noon on the 8th to resupply again. Whilst there, Somerville received concrete intelligence on the true strength of the Kido Butai in the region, and also new orders. He wasn't allowed anywhere near Ceylon until it was certain that the enemy had gone away. He therefore assigned Force B to head for ports in Kenya to try and fix their freshwater issues, whilst Force A would head for the west coast of India, as even with the advantage of a radar-guided night strike and surface action by his flagship, he would find it rather difficult to successfully damage 5 fast fleet carriers to the extent that they couldn't strike back at him the next morning, whilst also having Warspite engage in a 4v1 duel with the entirety of the Congo class at point-blank range. Nagumo's approach to Trincomalee was now spotted by another British Catalina, whose sighting allowed the British to once again predict the timing of Nagumo's strike, this time the morning of the 9th. Ironically, now that the Eastern Fleet had withdrawn, although of course he didn't know that, Nagumo now started to get nervous about the Royal Navy hitting him in his flank whilst he was attacking Ceylon. Once again, the British ordered all ships to scramble out of the harbour, in this time Trincomalee. Based on the Japanese attack on Colombo, they anticipated pretty much a repeat action, with Japanese aircraft remaining far out to sea to avoid coast watch stations which could give advanced warning, before turning in to make their attack runs, which they would mainly concentrate on port facilities. The carrier Hermes, along with the destroyer HMAS Vampire, were thus ordered to sail along the coast to the south, which should therefore be in the Japanese Navy's blind spot. Ideally, they wanted to go north, but Ruggio's group was roughly in that direction. Also sent out in other groups were a mine layer, a corvette, 3 tankers, 4 ammunition ships, and a hospital ship. Some vessels which couldn't work up steam in time or had good defences were retained, in particular the 15-inch armed monitor HMS Erebus, with its massive bulges and relatively open deck space, allowed for a good concentration of anti-aircraft guns and a relatively low likelihood that she could be sunk. At 0600 on the 9th, the Kido Butai launched 91 bomb-armed Kates and 38 Zeros as escorts, with 85 Vals and 9 more Zeros on hot standby. This time, the British radar station in the area worked, and after an early morning false alarm, which turned out to be them spotting a reconnaissance aircraft, the incoming strike was spotted 91 miles out, even as another Catalina radioed in the position of the Japanese fleet, which it had found shortly before it was shot down. The first encounter between the incoming Japanese strike aircraft and the defenders came in the form of 3 Hurricanes. These had gained an altitude advantage over the strike formation, passing over them, noting and reporting their strength, and then coming in from above and behind on one of the fighter escort groups, shooting down Zuikaku's fighter commander and another Zero before pulling up again, pursued by the surviving Japanese fighters, which managed to down one of the attackers in return. The 2 surviving Hurricanes then went after some of the bombers, but one of them was accidentally shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire as the formation crossed the coastline, and the other, breaking away from the bursting anti-aircraft shells, took out another Zero instead. But this relatively small skirmish didn't materially affect the Japanese plans, and their attack began at 0720. Trincomalee had far fewer fighters assigned to defend it compared to Colombo. Another dozen Hurricanes were on their way, but the remaining Zeros, forewarned by this first encounter, were on a sharp lookout. Now, interestingly, despite a numerical superiority and an on-paper significant advantage in aircraft, the Zeros were not able to rack up the kill counts or ratios against pre-warned Hurricanes than they had over the scrambling ones in Colombo. A trio of Hurricanes were jumped by twice as many Zeros, but only lost 1 of their number. Another section of 3 were all shot down, but in return claimed 2 Zeros, as well as damage to some of the Kates. All told, across all engagements, 8 Hurricanes would be shot down, with some others damaged, whilst 14 more aircraft, mostly strike variants, were destroyed on the ground by Japanese bombers. Some disruption to the Japanese attack had been accomplished, and between this and the scattering of ships, only 1 merchantman was actually sunk, but extensive damage to various port facilities was nonetheless inflicted. The monitor Erebus was targeted, the Japanese pilots variously thinking of her as a cruiser or battleship in their reports, but the calculation of her presence turned out to be fairly well founded. 6 near misses riddled her starboard bulges and caused casualties, but she remained comfortably afloat. In exchange, the Japanese had lost at least 3 Zeros and 1 Kate shot down and 17 other aircraft damaged, some badly enough to have thought to have been shot down at the time when they'd been attacked. But the qualified good news of a relatively decent stand in the air was about the best that the British were going to get that day. Although the gambit of sending the port shipping south close inshore had worked perfectly against the Japanese strike formation, which had no idea they'd completely bypassed them, a seaplane from Haruna was another matter. At about 0800, it spotted Hermes and other small craft and radioed its findings back to Nagumo. The 85 Vals and 9 Zeros of the next formation were thus rapidly warmed up and sent skywards. Also in the air were 9 Blenheims, out of a total of 11 that had initially taken off, as 2 of them had suffered engine problems shortly thereafter. These 9 light bombers managed to sneak in close to the Kido Butai unnoticed. Indeed, although they were spotted at the very last minute, the first that many in the Japanese fleet knew about their presence was when a trio of bombs exploded just in front of Akagi's bows. This would unfortunately prove to be about as close as they got, and despite an almost uninterrupted approach, the Blenheims proved the lie of Billy Mitchell's claims of sweeping the seas with level bombers by completely failing to hit anything. They then made for safety, but the Japanese Navy's Combat Air Patrol, which was now waking up, fell on them and downed 4 of the aircraft, although one of Hiryu's best Zero pilots somehow contrived to lose a dogfight to the Blenheim of Sergeant McLennan and was shot down before other Zeros brought down the offending bomber in return. Meanwhile, over on the Ceylon coast, news that the air raid was over was being transmitted, and the carrier Hermes was now heading back north, when at 10:15 signals intel reported she'd been spotted and a Japanese strike force was on its way. There was precious little the carrier, which was without any aircraft at all at the time, could do other than accelerate to full speed and hope that it could get under the cover of Trincomalee's guns as fast as possible. Fighters were ordered to be scrambled to give Hermes some air cover, but for some reason there was a lag of almost 30 minutes from the scramble order to takeoff, a delay which would prove to have fatal consequences. 3 minutes before the first Fulmar had even taken off from its airfield, the Vals had spotted Hermes, and then at 10:50 they commenced their attack. As with the heavy cruisers, the Japanese dive bombers faced no opposition other than the anti-aircraft batteries of Hermes and Vampire, and could take their time to position themselves for textbook attacks with close-in releases. Predictably, the hits started coming in thick and fast. Lookouts reported Vals sweeping past below them as they pulled out of their dives. However, the old carrier proved a remarkably resilient beast, and was still afloat with enough bomb holes in her to resemble a slightly on-fire Swiss cheese. But still more hits sealed her fate, and she sank shortly before 1100, taking 307 men, including her captain, down with her. In the last stages of the Japanese attack, the Fulmars finally arrived, downing 4 Vals in exchange for the loss of 2 Fulmars, but with the attack essentially over, the majority of the Vals could just hightail it, which left the Zeros with a much simpler combat problem to solve. Poor old Vampire had been attacked by any Val that couldn't find an unoccupied attack vector heading for Hermes, and with at least 5 damaging near misses and 2 direct hits, she too sank, although with only 8 men dead. On the way back, the Japanese force ran into the remaining Blenheims, which were also on their way home, and the escorting Zeros duly went after them. Although, once more, the thoroughly obsolete light bombers proved weirdly capable against the Zeros, with the total score of that final aerial encounter being 1 aircraft shot down on each side. 24 of the Vals had been unable to get a drop on either Hermes or Vampire before it was clear that both ships were doomed, and so these split up and searched up and down the coast hoping to find something else. They found 2 of the tankers, a merchant ship and the corvette, and sank them all over the course of the early afternoon before they also headed home. With that, Nagumo decided he'd done enough, and the Kido Butai turned for home itself. At the cost of 17 or possibly 18 aircraft destroyed and about twice as many damaged, he'd sunk a small carrier, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 older destroyers, an armed merchant cruiser, a corvette, a sloop, and a number of merchant ships, whilst also damaging 2 important port facilities. There was little else he could do with his available forces unless the elusive Eastern Fleet appeared, and so the Kido Butai left the Indian Ocean, on the way back receiving news of the Doolittle raid launched by USS Hornet against their homeland. Some of the carriers needed to refuel and rearm for their next mission, the one that would lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea, whilst the others prepared for the one that would follow from that, and would in turn lead to the Battle of Midway. The operation as a whole, even without looking at Ruggio's little raid, was an undoubted Japanese victory. The Eastern Fleet would remain in the western portion of the Indian Ocean for quite some time, and of course the British had suffered far larger losses. But it was still a qualified victory. Without any troops to follow up their success, the Kido Butai could not challenge overall British control of the area on a permanent basis, and the facilities in Ceylon were soon repaired and reinforced with more and better fighters and strike aircraft squadrons. Additionally, although of course every ship and life lost was painful, in the long term, of all the ships that were sunk, only the loss of the 2 heavy cruisers, which could have been put to good work in the Mediterranean in the next few months, had any significant effects on the overall ongoing British war effort. The loss of the various merchant ships was much more impactful in their area, as it curtailed the available tonnage for moving materials on the eastern side of India for many months until they could be replaced. When it comes to Somerville, opinions are sharply divided amongst historians, an argument that actually goes all the way back to the immediate aftermath of the raid. Was he too reckless? Was he too timid? What portion of the blame for the loss of the heavy cruisers is his, and what is the Admiralty's for ordering him to prepare for Operation Ironclad, the aforementioned attack on Vichy Madagascar, etc., etc.? On the one hand, his primary orders were to preserve the main fighting strength of the Eastern Fleet, which could have been largely wiped out in his efforts to attack Nagumo had the dice fallen in Nagumo's way and he'd gotten word of the presence of so many British ships within easy close-in striking distance during the day. On the other hand, passively sitting back and letting Ceylon get hit repeatedly would have strained inter-service relations considerably, tanked morale in the fleet, and led to a myriad questions about whether or not the Royal Navy was actually an effective combat force. His aggression, in trying to bring Nagumo to battle on his terms, was in the finest tradition of the Royal Navy. At the same time, both sides spent much of the operation running on hopelessly wrong intel about the size and scope of the other side's fleet. And hindsight makes it easy for us these days to get a warped idea about what he should have done, based on the full size of the fleets versus what he actually knew. Against the full force of the Kido Butai, there's not a lot you could realistically have expected Somerville to do, but against 2 carriers and a few escorts, which is what everyone thought he was facing, retreat would have been very difficult to explain. In my personal opinion, I think Somerville largely did the right thing, but got very unlucky. Ironically, much like Jellicoe decades earlier, partial intel from ashore perhaps made things a lot worse. In this case, if all he'd had to go on was the partial report from the Albacore, he might well have held his course and then managed to encarry Carrier Division 2, as he got more intel once the Albacore landed. Whereas the hours-old report from ashore that the Kido Butai was proceeding at speed straight at him was what made him turn back. If that report had never made it to Ceylon to be forwarded to him, or had never been forwarded to him even if Ceylon had received it, what might have been? Well, that's it for this video, but if you tune in on Friday, we'll go over some of the potential ways that fight might indeed have gone down, including the rather hilarious, if disturbingly plausible scenario that the first carrier versus carrier kill could have been a surface gunfight.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.